on a simple, basic, fundamental human right, do you think it is right that the difference between me having a child or you not having one is how much money I have? And if you want to distill it to that fairness, and I personally get accused of finding that David and Goliath story all the time, but that's just it's deeply unfair. It's just wrong on so many levels.
Today's episode is paid content from our feature sponsor, who helps Inside Reproductive Health to deliver information for free to you. Here, the advertiser has editorial control. Feature sponsorship is not an endorsement and does not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health.
Fertility doctors, you sell something that no one wants. You sell and perform something that people very much need, but think of it in those terms. No one wants to buy an IVF cycle. They want a baby. The risk of what you do in the case of most patients is placed on them. Is that fair? Heck no. Is it fair for that risk to just be transferred to you? I don't think that's fair either. Someone else needs to de-risk this process for each of you, someone with an exceptional model. I'm going to introduce you to Nader AlSalim. He's the founder of a company called Gaia. I had dinner with him last ASRM, and the whole time I was thinking, this is someone you're going to want to talk to. CEOs and practice owners, he talks about how innovation needs to stop being isolated to the IVF lab, innovating so that after a protection fee, patients only pay for a baby. But how do you incentivize your revenue cycle managers to implement? What do revenue cycle managers really want? Revenue cycle managers, the latter part of this episode is for you. The fastest payer on the market, no prior auths, and everything done in 3 clicks? Listen up. We're putting contact links and buttons to reach out to Gaia everywhere this podcast is distributed. If you're in the car driving and you can't click on anything, Gaia is spelled G-A-I-A. Find their contact info on their website. But if you're listening to this prior to ASRM 2024, try to get on Nader's schedule. Talk to him about one of these topics. Challenge him if you want. But have these conversations now or be an instrument of an unfair past. Enjoy this conversation with Nader AlSalim, founder and CEO of Gaia. Mr. AlSalim, Nader, welcome to the Inside Reproductive Health podcast.
Thank you, Griffin. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Be agnostic for a moment. Be a Vulcan from the Star Trek world, this logical race that isn't from this world, that doesn't have emotion. They only think in logic. You come to the planet Earth and you see how IVF is paid for, is sold, and you have to report that back to the Vulcans in a completely emotionless, passionless, logical manner. What's in your report?
You wouldn't believe I came down to Earth and there is this industry that had seen explosive growth by selling something that people don't want. Imagine they start selling something that people want.
Tell me about that. What do you mean by that?
I'll say I went down and a bunch of excellent doctors and excellent providers that are selling people cycles of IVF. They may or may not lead the result that they want, but people want to buy babies, but people are buying cycles. And there's this crazy mismatch between what people want to buy and what providers are selling. And that created such a misalignment in incentives. Then we structured the whole economics of that model on what I want to buy and what you want to sell. And given that it's the only time in healthcare that it's not the same commodity, and I would report that I found this exceptionally shocking.
So it is exceptional in your view in with regard to the rest of healthcare?
What part of healthcare do you buy without any control or visibility on the outcome? Yet you pay for the price regardless. Because all of healthcare is a marginal improvement. And you'd argue that the component of value-based when it comes to any point solution is a gradual improvement on a scale. But when it comes to fertility treatments, it's the only time you couldn't have a more binary outcome and you can measure it. Yet you're paying for the underlying unit of that treatment, not the outcome of that treatment.
It's hard to think of this passionately, isn't it? Because I looked at your company's Instagram and a few weeks back, there was a post that says, how the F are we going to pay for this? And I looked at the comments of what people say. And some people were saying, I had to get a high interest loan. I just didn't have another way of being able to do that. Other people were saying it was all of our savings. Another person says side gigs, extra shifts, no vacations, savings, all of it. It's hard to see people going through that and then just think of it in an actuarial sense, isn't it?
I couldn't agree more. And I think, like I'll add, people remortgage. If you go on crowdfunding platforms today, you'll see pages for families that are crowdfunding for IVF journeys. People remortgage their own house. People go to friends and family. Grandparents, I think, fund about 20% of treatment. I think the very ugly reason that those treatments are expensive is because they can afford to be, because people will pay everything they have and they don't have for a baby. And you have this unique dynamic where demand is fairly inelastic because of that price of the hope that it's fairly untangible. And usually the two forces that exist in order to put pressure down on pricing are either a public healthcare payer, which does not exist in the US, or sufficient insurance coverage to put pressure on pricing, which also does not exist. Absence of those two forces that stabilize prices, everybody reports that these things are expensive, but nobody reports why are they expensive. And the reason is you can be as expensive as your local market dynamic allow you to be because you're pricing an inelastic demand into a commoditized product being a cycle, not linked to the outcome. So you create exactly what you just seen, where people will wonder how would they fund this? And they go to really bizarre means on how to fund that put them at more financial risk than they would otherwise, which adds a lot of more strain to what is emotionally and physically a very painful experience.
One of the things that you said earlier, thinking of if you were reporting back to Planet Vulcan, that there are people that are in pursuit of an outcome, but they're paying for a method regardless of the outcome. Is it possible now to get to this world that David Sable's been talking about, of pay for baby, not for cycle? Is it possible to be there now?
I think it is possible to be there now. And I don't want to put that pressure on the providers themselves. And I think the provision of care and the payment of care is the crux of why we've created a healthcare system in the US that is so fundamentally broken because of the misalignment of incentives. Is there a possibility for you kind of payer to come and say, I'm going to move this market from a cycle basis to outcome basis? I think the answer is yes. And there is no breaking news in this, right? No one wants to buy an IVF cycle and quote our dear friend David Sable again. He'll be the first to tell you that certainly no one wants to pay for a negative cycle. The ability to transfer the risk of a bad outcome and a bad outcome, no baby, from a patient to the provider will be an enormous competitive advantage. And what we do, which a lot of people hold as like innovation, I would call as a great form of dinosaur insurance. We apply a 19th century insurance model to a 21st century problem. And much of that innovation happened by moving the risk of a negative outcome from the provider onto the patient, onto us. And managing that risk is the business that the patient should be in, because again, I do not want anyone to pay if they don't have the outcome they desire.
But the providers can't assume the risk on their own, right? Or I think it would be extremely difficult to say that just the providers, without having additional help, would be able to say, we're just charging you if there is a successful live birth. Would that be possible? Why do they need the help of someone else?
Because I don't think the provider should be in the business of risk management. I think the provider should be in the business of care management. And the separation of the two by having a specialized risk management on top of your care delivery that is at arm's length, where you're not betting against your own odds because the house will always have better information asymmetry, which is a critical problem in IVF to begin with. You are creating a risk-bearing business outside of the provider that is interacting with the patient, where the provider gets paid regardless of the outcome, and I'm managing the risk on someone else's behalf. I do think it creates a cleaner transfer of risk between all three parties at a much more transparent way to render the service versus a wraparound by which I provide the service and I provide the warranty.
When you said a new way to pay for this, Gaia is a new way to pay for this. Your model is different, though, than that 19th century insurance model. What are the differences?
I think the fundamental difference where Gaia operates in as a business model to begin with is we said there shouldn't be a way by which you're paying this on a cycle basis because it doesn't make any sense because of what we said earlier. You shouldn't buy this in bulk because healthcare should not be bought in bulk in order to get some value out of it. What should be is a better way to predict the risk on two levels, on an individual patient level and on a clinic level. And I want to reflect the personalized risk of that patient performing at that clinic in the form of any other insurance that you buy that would calculate your personal chances of something happening based on your own personal data. And in this case, it could be your biomarkers, it could be your clinical data, it could be the clinic performance, and so on and so forth. And then the way this is very different fundamentally is we shifted the market from a fee for service into an outcome based, and shifting that not on a select few or on those who are eligible, shifting that on every single person that goes through the IVF, so that we're pricing the risk, not rejecting the risk, and we're passing that on risk to the patient, is how this is highly differentiated. Because with Gaia,
Explain that to me, the difference between pricing the risk versus rejecting the risk.
absolutely. When you put a LinkedIn post the other day and you're asking for questions, there's a gentleman who asked a very good question. It's like, how do I know that Gaia is not cherry picking the risk? Right. Which is a very valid question, because you could design like risk shared programs and you could say 1 in 10 people will be eligible. So that's a shared risk program where I cherry the risk for those who qualify. And Gaia's approach is a little bit different. We said, our job is to understand Griffin's chances of success on an individual basis, and for me to price the risk reflecting your probability of success. My job is not to lump you with a 35-year-old. My job is not to say this is the laws of averages. My job is not to say that people like you will have chances of X. I actually want to understand your own performance as a patient, and I want to correlate that with the patient's performance at that clinic. And together, I move very close to the unit of risk that I'm measuring, which is the predictability of IVF as an outcome. And if I can do that, why can't I underwrite it? And what we pride ourselves here, and we try to do a lot of education, no two people at Gaia will have the same price to start IVF, because no two people will have identical risk. Not because they happen to be 35, not because they happen to have a PCOS or any other condition. And I think that's highly differentiating, because then you're moving that risk unit to the individual, and then you're superimposing the clinic performance on that individual. So you really move as close to reality or to the truth as possible. And then you'd say, my job is to give you a price for that risk. Your job, if you want to accept it or not, as opposed to say, you're eligible, you're not eligible. And today, our eligibility is about 92%. So 9 out of 10 will walk away with a price to reflect their chances.
What's insufficient about the current shared risk programs that have been introduced? What's lacking with those types of programs?
I'm not criticizing them. I think they were great when they were introduced, and some of them are going on to 30 years, and they're clearly like a bulk of innovation if you go back all the way to when they started. I think there is a bit of the one size fits all element that does not work. I think there's a little bit of the standardization of the packages based on, if Griffin needs 4 cycles of IVF and Nader needs 2 cycles of IVF, the solution is not to sell them both 3. And back in the day when we didn't have the data that will allow us to go on an actuarial level of what is the relative performance of each cycle and the enhanced probability of each cycle, that was the easy approach to create these shared risk programs based on multi-cycle approach. But today, if Griffin needs 4 and Nader needs 2, you need 4 and I need 2, and both of us will not use 3 because someone would have overpaid or underpaid by 1. And we're eliminating that sort of bundling from a group basis to an individual basis.
How did you get into all of this, both from the actuarial background and why the fertility space?
I do ask myself that question a lot. And I think the answer is a complete accident. My story is very well documented, and I do not want to bore yet another podcast audience with it. But it's the reason I have a child. I had $100,000 to spare, so I spent 5 IVF cycles in over 3 years in 2 clinics in 2 countries. And you wouldn't believe it, but I would go to the doctor after every failed cycle and ask a simple question: what happened and what happens next? And they go, we don't know. And I've always thought, what an insane answer. And yet I do exactly the same thing and expect a different outcome, which is the definition of being insane. I would show up the next day and pony up 15,000 and say, I'm ready to go. Let's go. And it's such a bizarre experience, because that emotional lottery of going round after round, expecting a different results, but you actually don't know what happened and you don't know what informed the next decision. And that journey took a while. And then the more I started being part of that journey as a patient myself, you crystallize the problem, right? The better the treatment gets at solving the infertility, the more intolerable the lack of access or the lack of better outcome becomes. But the reality, which is what informed sort of the business model around being insurance or spending a lot of time on actuarial, is cost remains the greatest barrier to infertility any way you cut it or slice it, right? You've seen the stats all over the news, and you've seen how many babies out of 100 in the US are born out of IVF and how many people in other parts of the world. And it's not like people from other parts of the world like IVF more than the US does. It just costs an arm and a leg, and it's free in many other places. And what I kept thinking about is the misalignment of the unit of sale versus the unit of outcome. And I kept going back to the lack of someone in the middle who's de-risking the probability of a negative outcome. And I kept going back to not being able to understand the patient risk at a very small and accurate unit. And in any other forms of insurance, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my background earlier, but in any form of insurance and the way it works in multiple contexts in finance, there is this old saying, if you can predict it, you can price it. And if I can predict it, why can't I price it? If I can predict it, why can I underwrite the risk of it? If I can predict the probability of a hurricane in a certain state, that I can define a financial instrument that protects against that hurricane, why is it different when it comes to a woman having a child? Because so long as it's non-random and I can predict it with a degree of accuracy, certainly means I can negate that risk of a negative outcome by providing an underlying insurance against that risk not happening. And I started going down that path, and it didn't evolve much, to be honest. It evolved maybe in certain nuance of the product and the structure, but the premise of it on day one, after year 4, it's exactly the same. We want to be the first value-based underwriter of fertility treatments, moving that market from the unit of a retail sale of a cycle to that of an outcome.
If I can predict it, why can't I price it? Why have the traditional insurance models not been sufficient in being able to achieve that?
Lack of data, lack of will, lack of innovation, all three. I think if you're an insurer of a certain scale, even when I started, people would think fertility is like this niche little problem that affects a small percentage of the population. So on their list of priorities, it's probably very low. And what is the low-hanging fruit if you are a large insurer with a large book that is managing billions of volumes of other form of insurance, and healthcare on its own is hard to navigate. So the point solutions even gets relegated to second order. 2, I think absent a mandate, there is a lack of care, meaning if you can get away without providing that cover, why would you? And lack of innovation. And I don't think you look at the insurance world and you think, what an innovative bunch.
That's true. I don't think the model has changed much, at least not from the consumer perspective, for decades, as far as I can tell, being a consumer. I think we need to get into the mechanics of how Gaia works a little bit, because it is radically different than these previous uninnovative models, as far as I can tell. And I don't think that I can paint the picture for people at the level of detail that you can. Tell me about how Gaia works.
I'll give you an example on our IVF product, which is one of our products, but I'll give you an example because it's simple and it's straightforward. So you come to me and I predict the risk of your success and failure over cumulative rounds of IVF up to 6 cycles. And then that risk will tell me what is the level of protection fee that you need to pay in order to start. You tell me, what is a protection fee? A protection fee is akin to a premium. You pay it at the beginning of the cycle. It is a percentage of the total cost of the cycle. It is personalized to reflect your own chances of success. You pay me that protection fee at the start. It's about 25% of the cost of a cycle. I pay the clinic on your behalf. You don't have to worry about a single payment that comes your way. Every single payment, every single line item, every single treatment that the clinic will charge you, I will pay it on your behalf. All you have to part way is that 25% of the cost at the beginning. Then you go do the cycles that you'd want. When you have a baby, you pay me $400 a month. If you don't have a baby, you pay me nothing.
This is a mix of insurance and patient financing, isn't it?
Correct. And I think it's a good point that you picked on, because what we do not do, and I think it's such a lazy way to label Gaia, we're not a financing option. We're far from a financing option. We're not in the business of financing IVF. I don't think that's remotely close to anything that we do, because we don't finance the process, we finance the outcome. So with the example that I just spoke to you, financing only kicks in to pay me back what I paid on your behalf in case you walked away with a child. So what you're financing is the outcome. If there is no outcome, there is no financing, because I'm going to waive the cost of the treatment that I've paid on your behalf.
And the difference between this and shared risk is that in traditional shared risk, I would pay a much higher premium if I were not to have a baby after a certain number of cycles. But this is, I pay a certain amount, I pay a percentage of the IVF cycle. That is the protection fee. And then I either have a baby and then I pay over time, or I don't and I pay nothing. Is that the difference between this and traditional shared risk?
Correct. Amongst other nuance, but the crux of the difference is that you're not overpaying for cycles you do not use. You're repaying the cycles that you use in order to get the outcome that you want, whether it's one, whether it's two, whether it's three. And I think that's fundamentally different than you committing to paying 3 cycles, regardless of what the outcome is and whether you got pregnant out of 1, 2, or 3. It's the same bill. It's just a much more fairer way to estimate that risk and get to charge for that risk.
How did this work in the UK?
The national health system in the UK, it's such a source of pride for all of us. But I think the reality is, when it comes to fertility treatments, it does fail. We built this world-class healthcare system that is publicly funded, but when it comes to the elective treatment of fertility treatments, we just don't do it sufficiently. The NHS funds about 25% of all treatments in the UK, and 75% of those treatments are privately funded. If you think about it and how it equates to the US, it's very similar to how the employer market plays out with the cash payer. So about 25% of it is covered by the employer of some sort through your house plan, and about 75% of it is paid out of pocket. So similar dynamic from that. If you double click on the 75%, i.e. how do people like you and I pay for it if they're not covered by their employers, it's a very similar pattern to how the US market pays for it. It's a bunch of things, right? Savings, loans, credit cards, friends and family. From a market structure and dynamic, it's exactly the same. The little contribution that happens from the public healthcare system, it's the same that happens from the employer in the US. And then the combination of them opens up a big market before it comes to the cash payer. The 2 things that are different here is we do not have a private healthcare model in the UK. There isn't that model. People don't buy private healthcare the way that they do it in the US, especially from an insurance perspective. And especially from a coverage perspective, they don't. It's often these elective treatments that fall outside of the public healthcare spending that gets paid out of cash. So the level of awareness on how to pay for IVF and how to optimize for the outcomes, and whether it's egg freezing, embryo batching, so on and so forth, is weaker as it compared. So against that backdrop, we've launched here 2.5 years ago. And the success that we've had is a true reflection that there was a big need in the market, because the market was not as big as it needed to be because a lot of people are priced out. And 2.5 years in, hundreds of people through the program, we've underwritten thousands of cycles now. I still think our most human KPI, we're now delivering a baby every 6 days in the UK. With that in mind, if you look at the composition of the people that we're serving, 20% of the people that we're serving, for example, today are same-sex couples. Today in the UK, they don't qualify for any form of funding. And you look at the diversity of the regions that we're covering, and you look at the difference that we're making on those people's lives, because a lot of the members, and you'd see it through a lot of the testimonies that come through, will tell you very openly that if it weren't for that protection, if it weren't for that early place to start, it wasn't for that low cost to start, they just wouldn't embark on a family. So for you to understand that the difference that you're making is you are the reason why this family exists or not, it's a very humbling metric by which we should hold ourselves accountable to how much we can expand the market. Because what annoys me a lot, especially about the US market, is we decided to fantasize about how to improve access for those who already have access.
Upper class people that can afford it, for example, and then they get employer coverage because they are the people that work for the type of companies in the type of positions where employer coverage is common.
Precisely. And we said, for those people, we're just not going to stop innovating because you already have access, but we're going to make our access much better. But if you're not working for Google, tough luck. If you're a public school teacher from Ohio, we don't care enough about you. And we're just not going to innovate because you don't deserve the same chance at having a family as someone who happened to be employed by an employer within a certain class that allowed their employees. And I think there couldn't be anything morally wrong than that. I'm not saying this is bad. We should innovate across the spectrum, and those people deserve better access. And if you have them easy, deserve better access. But we should just not leave people out. And what's happening today, Griffin, we are leaving people out, and we are sending the message that we don't care about you.
Tell me more about that, because I've heard you talk about a value-based mission, and these types of values seem to be what you're talking about now. But how does that integrate into what you're doing?
On a very lofty vision, don't you want a world where anyone who wants a family can? on a simple, basic, fundamental human right, do you think it is right that the difference between me having a child or you not having one is how much money I have? And if you want to distill it to that fairness, and I personally get accused of finding that David and Goliath story all the time, but that's just deeply, it's deeply unfair, just wrong on so many levels. And it's not only for people who want treatment. Like, just imagine if you're modeling what's future behavior is going to be in terms of consumption, it's becoming very apparent that it's outside of heterosexual couples that are starting treatment. Think about the LGBTQ families that are being formed. Think about rare disease risk and people who would need to eliminate that risk of inherited disease by using IVF. Think about oncology patients that have to freeze because obviously not by choice. Think about the large and growing elective treatments such as social egg freezing. And today, we've created a world where you'd say all of that is available if you have the means, and all of that is unavailable if you don't. I think that's the fundamental value that grounds us here, that we need to make sure that there is equity, and we need to level the playing field between those who don't have the means and those who do.
Why now, though? Why not 5 or 10 years ago? Why not 5 or 10 years from now? What inflection points are happening in the fertility space now?
There has been an explosive growth in the last 10 to 20 years where when you're witnessing that growth, you're usually not worried much about where the new wave of growth comes. And I think that's what pertained in the fertility space. I will quote from Pinnacle: innovation should stop being in the lab. And I think that's the inflection point that's really happening in fertility.
Innovation should stop being isolated to the lab?
Correct. Innovation is not restricted to the lab. And I think that's a good point, because that is the inflection point that's happening. That is allowing people to understand that there is a bigger market where we're far off the true potential of the market. The goal of 1 million baby a month may seem lofty, but it's not lofty. It's basic math. And given where we are versus where we need to be, there is a lot of innovation that needed to happen yesterday so that we can catch up on that. And innovation should not be restricted to what happens in the lab as it has been for the last 20 to 30 years. And on that spectrum, there is a lot of things that need to happen. There are mighty and exciting companies. I love what Josh and Alan are doing at Conceivable, with the aim to reinvent the whole hardware and software of it, but also reinvent the lab. And we need to innovate on the most basic unit of treatment. But we also need to go further to say, yes, we're innovating on what's happening in the lab and how the lab and the services are rendered, but how about we innovate on how we sell it and how we price it and how we package it? And that end-to-end is now happening because people have realized that the market has grown to a certain level, yet the market that's priced outside that we're not serving is far bigger than the market that we're truly serving today. And if you want to realize the opportunity, whether you want to chase the missing babies or you want to chase the missing dollars, whatever is your incentive, that market should be at the crux of innovation right now, or that inflection point, as you say.
Everything that you've said to me thus far makes complete sense and sounds like it could completely transform access to care in a way that we have not been able to achieve thus far, because this is a meaningfully different model, Nader. But now I want to get to a sticky point, a potential bottleneck, which is clinic operations. How do you work with all of them? And let me start with another one of those questions that came from one of our listeners on LinkedIn, which is, what about reimbursement rates and what about undercutting clinics? And when I've heard clinics talk about the employer benefits groups or insurance coverage in the past, sometimes they like a lot of things about them, but other times they will show me what they're being reimbursed and it's a fraction of what they're getting, and then they're effectively subsidizing the cost. So what's the incentive for clinics?
It is a good sticky point, by the way. And I think if you go to clinics today versus 5 years and you contract how they feel about the emerging payers in the employer space, you'll have a very different response to the initial excitement of all that added volume versus the actual cents on the dollar that they collect from all that added volume. And I think this is our opportunity, quite frankly, because there's a fatigue from payers, not only from a reimbursement rate, from how they work, from authorization, from inefficient processes, legacy systems, you name it, right? The quickest eye roll that you will get is talking to another revenue cycle management personnel and telling them, I'm a new payer. And that doesn't stop at I'm collecting less cents on a dollar. That goes all the way to the process. I would like to really use this as an opportunity for shameless self-marketing and say there needs to be an emergence of a new payer, a fundamentally different payer that does not stop and start at better reimbursement rate, but goes all the way to making the life of the revenue cycle management personnel at a clinic substantially better, so that you're incentivizing them to work with you, not being arm twisted to work with you. Number two is contracts that last are by definition fair to both parties, and there is enough juice in them so that they sustain themselves without one being squeezed more than the other should. Clinics' margins are no rocket science. Where clinics do hurt is not rocket science. We're very transparent about what do we need in order to make the math work. So long as we're in the money and we're passing some of that to the clinic so they continue doing the great service that they do and getting paid for it, no one wants to get the clinic out of business. And certainly I don't want to enter into a contract where I squeeze the clinic to the point by which rendering the service is no longer viable. But I'm happy because I'm squeezing them because of the margin, because that is not equitable when it comes to creating the power relationship I want to create with a clinic. We're building a network. We're building a high-performing network. It doesn't mean that we're going to work with every single clinic. It means that we're going to work with the select few and that we're able to reward their excellence because we are outcome-based as opposed to volume-based. It also means it's very important to us as a new payer to own the end-to-end experience substantially better than any other clinic and reward them on a better reimbursement rate, but also make sure that we're making their life easier, because there are horror stories of how payers get paid and what's the process and what's the mechanics that we're trying to eliminate by being a technology-focused company as opposed to a paper-based company pushing volume.
I want to pull out something that you said about incentivizing revenue cycle management and the people that are behind the implementation, because I bet all of the CEOs listening are just picking up what you're saying and they see it and they see the value in it. I would expect that their challenge would be, how do I implement this? How do I incentivize my middle managers, those people that implement, to get on board?
I always say, with all the respect, a lot of the CEOs get super excited about Gaia, and that's wonderful. The champions within any provider network is the revenue cycle management decision makers that will make this happen or not make this happen. And designing a seamless process, what do they want is the question, right? They want simplicity. They already have so many things to do and so many payers to deal with and so many obscure and legacy systems to deal with. Reducing the friction points between clinic referral pathways, authorization, the lack of prior authorization, agreeing everything up front, transparent rate system, no back and forth. We eliminated all of that. So we're creating almost no friction. And we always say we'll contract on 3 clicks between you seeing a patient and you referring a patient and you getting paid, versus filling ungodly long forms, faxing it to somewhere in the ether, waiting for a response that may or may not come so that you can get paid 180 days before. We're the fastest payer in the market today. We pay upon the completion of any service on a scheduled timeline, on a pre-agreed schedule with no back and forth and no prior authorization. And that alone will improve the life of anyone substantially better than anyone that you've seen from a payer perspective.
The revenue cycle manager's ears are probably perking up right now, but I am not a revenue cycle manager. So explain how this is different from the normal process. You alluded to it a bit with faxes and longer terms, but tell me about how the process often looks versus how it looks in your process.
What do they want? They want to get paid the closest number to their cash dollar in the fastest possible way by filling the least amount of forms. That's what they want, right? Forget all the fancy acronyms, just forget it. We make sure that they get the closest cent on the dollar to their cash price, and they get paid the quickest possible with the least amount of clicks that they need to click on in order to submit a form in order to get paid. That's what we do. And if you compare us to a normal process, any of these metrics, we cut it by a half, if not more. An average payer takes 120 days to pay an invoice. We pay in 30. That alone would save a ton from the revenue cycle management perspective by how much they need to chase a payment and how much they need to wait on a payment of an opportunity cost of their dollars not being sent, versus someone who will honor the payment on a schedule in a very transparent way.
I know you're not in the lead gen business per se, but it also seems to me like you could help clinics with their patient pipeline, because you have patients that find you at the consumer level and get qualified, they get in your system, and a good percentage of them aren't matched with a clinic. Am I inferring too much about how you would help with that? But it seems to me like you've got a lot of patients that then need a clinic to go to.
I think you're right to start with it, that it's a not lead gen model. We say with clinics as we build the network, 2/3 of the people that come to Gaia today, top of the funnel, do not have a clinic in mind, which is telling you something very important.
2/3?
Thirds. It's telling you something that we both know, which is people are beginning the journey of through how do I pay for this thing versus where do I go? And if they're coming to me to figure out how to pay, the next natural step in that process is to send them somewhere to go. And what we do without any monetization of any effect, because that's the bi-directional partnership that we would have with the clinic. And that's the point of working with a select few of networks, not too many, is in every area we start directing the people that don't have a clinic in mind to a default clinic that we work with, so that this becomes us sending them qualified leads that are interested in pursuing treatment, that are very close, like, or very low in the funnel, the clinic network that we have, so that our providers get the first dibs at sending them that traffic before they go and they try to find somewhere else, or they shop somewhere else and they go outside. And it's been a very effective, bi-directional, highly appreciated flow of traffic that we gather that is outside of the remit of the clinic. There is also a concept of an arm's length, and who do they trust more as the advisor to come and start the journey. You've seen a lot of emerging brands, whether it's on communities or support or any of the ancillary business, that people come to them in order to recommend the clinic. People struggle, like, how do I fund this treatment? How do I pay for it? Is there any other solution other than what exists today? And people come to us. And again, if 2/3 of the traffic comes directly to us before a clinic, that will tell you a lot about the direction of travel.
It seems to me like that might also help with retention. Some people might say, I've got a full pipeline, but then they are losing patients in between cycles, or they're losing people in between new patient consult and IVF. How does this help with conversion or patient retention?
I think such a good point. And I was surprised to see that not a lot of clinics do actually measure retention. And some of them do, and some of them don't. Some of them measure the unit of the first sale or cycle that they do versus how many cycles do they sell on a journey. And with Gaia today, 80% or 78% of the people that walk through the door end up with a baby on an average of 2.2 cycles. If you see what do they do in comparison to the national average, that's about 60% uplift number of cycles of what they would have done otherwise. So a good sticking point has always been patients with us will go further. When they go further, that means two things happen. They stick with you for longer. You increase the revenue per patient, but you also see the success outcome of that because they've stuck with you and they didn't go somewhere else and someone else picked up the benefit of that. So you don't only see the LTV increase, you also see the outcome associated with that increased journey.
And there's a patient experience component to that too, isn't there? Because probably 8 years ago now, I analyzed several hundred reviews, maybe thousands of reviews, and I categorized those reviews that were negative and those that were positive. And as you could expect, those that were negative had to do with a negative outcome that was not categorical. Some people were happy when they didn't have success, and some people were not happy when they did, but it was the biggest predictor on if someone was going to leave a negative review or a positive review. And no small part of that is because they forked over their life savings. They gave up that vacation. They put the second mortgage on the house. They sold the house. They didn't buy the house. They are late on their student loan payments because this is something that they had to put first. It seems to me like there's a patient experience, patient satisfaction component to this.
And it's critical, and it's critical for many reasons. And I like what you say, because this is a classic consumer experience problem. And it's something I personally quite like for two reasons, right? First reason is you are selling a service on top of a service, meaning not only your experience have to matter, but the place where they render the experience also have to matter because it needs to match. This is a classic Airbnb problem, right? You might have a great booking experience on Airbnb where everything is so clear and you pay and it's great and seamless, but you go to the actual unit and it's a disaster. And then who do you blame, the unit or do you blame Airbnb? Right. And it's the same experience. It's like the byproduct experiences that happens next and who gets the blame where and how. So it's a critical one to monitor what's happening next. The second aspect of it, I always like to remind ourselves, you are selling a service and a product that no one wants. In the ideal world, people wish I don't exist. This is not the kind of company that people say, I wish they existed. They actually rather for us not to exist because they would have not used us and they would have conceived in a much more simpler, straightforward way. And that adds a level of complexity when you're dealing with the consumer. The third, and the most important is, it's also a vulnerable consumer. You're dealing with the two of the closest thing to people's heart, money and health. The combination of that can either offer you an opportunity to reimagine the consumer experience and serve it the way we do today, which generally is sometimes beyond me of how good the team is in delivering that experience. Or you can just mess it up completely. And it's that critical. If you build the company on day one to say, we don't care about the financial utility or the function of the product, we care about the emotional benefit that we attach to the product. And we're going to craft an incredibly well-designed experience that's going to pay attention to every little detail along the way. People might not care about the outcome because they know they can't control it, but people will remember how you made them feel every little interaction along the way. And that matters much more than you controlling something that you can't control, being the outcome of the treatment and whether they end up happy or not happy. So the attention is really focused on what support do we give people along the way? So they're handheld, they're treated with respect and dignity. And there is just built-in empathy in every single word you use, adjective you use, feature you built. And if I tell you that the team's been laser focused on this, continue to be laser focused on this, and even go way above and beyond what's expected of them to deliver that experience, you'll see it reflected in what people say about the experience, not the product. And I think the two are very separate here for a reason. And I wish that a lot of the ecosystem service provider within the fertility had paid the same amount of attention to the journey of the human being that's going through this and designed it for them, because it's a classic design problem in healthcare. Everybody designs for two people. You either design for the payer or you design for the provider. And somewhere in the middle, you forget that there is a patient and you sandwich them in the middle, because the payer is often the person who pays or the provider who renders. And then somewhere along the line, people remember that there's a patient going through this and go, hold on, wait a second, how do we sandwich them in? And it's often too late.
You're selective about the clinics that you partner with. What makes a good clinic partner?
Outperform the national average when it comes to success rates. There's two things that matter. You want a clinic that quantitatively produces better results, what we call a first quartile. If you go to a new city, if you go to a new market, a new state, you chart all the performance. Clinic performance is charted by quartiles, and you want to pick a first quartile because that is the clinic you'd want to work with if you want to reward the outcome, not the process, and hence you're incentivized to work with the first quartile performance. The second thing, which is qualitative, which is the patient experience. You also want a clinic that has a reputation for great patient experience. The RAIs are very well known for delivering world-class experience, and it has the brand because of what I told you earlier, because my brand is attached to that clinic brand. And it's often that's where the most of the experience happens. We want to make sure that we're owning that journey or co-owning that journey. We're owning it with people that share our ethos when it comes to patient experience. So I think the outcome and the patient experience are what matters the most here.
You've had this success in the United Kingdom for a while, but now you're in the United States. What's that been like?
Another humbling experience. It's the world's largest IVF or fertility market. It is complicated because it's 50 states with 50 different mandates, with 50 different health plans integrations, with a lot of bells and whistles and regulations for all these states. Yet the fundamental need is exactly the same. The fundamental untapped demand is exactly the same. You couldn't be more excited about a market with that size and that potential. Finding the right partners has been a critical step in our US market entry. We went live a couple of months ago in Virginia with Pinnacle's asset there, Dominion, and early signs confirm everything that we know all along. There is a lot of work that needs to be done on how do we sequence the next states. The plan is to be in every single state with a select group of provider clinics, allowing them to improve access in those markets and or improve conversion if that's something that those markets suffer from due to competition or due to the lack of option or due to saturation of some sort. It's clearly a very differentiated product to add to your shelf. But more importantly, it's a different kind of payer that you need to integrate with. And the plan is, whether it's an employer, whether it's a health plan, whether it's a cash payer, we do not separate on the source of the funding or the source of the channel. We're focused across all channels to make sure that we serve the underlying patient. And we want to build the network to match those patients in the states that we want to be in. And we want to be in every single US state.
We've been talking about topics for the revenue cycle managers and the CEOs and some maybe the more senior clinicians. But what advice do you have for the younger REIs that are going to make a career of the next 30 years of how this transforms the way they practice?
And I think you're absolutely right. I think if you're a young REI today coming in and you want to build the next 20 to 30 years of your career, you're going to build it on a very different fundamental ways of practicing medicine than what has existed in the past. You're going to understand that technology in general will play an indispensable role in taking those treatments from an inconsistently performed, labor-intensive procedure to something that is optimized like in any other engineered industry. You're going to think about innovation, to go to Bess's point, not only what happens in the lab, in every structure along the way, whether it's patient acquisition, whether it's patient management, whether it's protocol management, what role can you play in order to go and take care of that very large unaddressed population of the patients in need? And last but not least, you cannot think of all these services and integration without thinking about the outcome-based pricing that you need to adopt in order to align more to what the patients want to buy, while you get paid for the service rendered, and someone needs to come and manage that on your behalf so that you're focusing on what you do best, which is care. And then you're moving that to a third party that comes, manages all of that, maybe in a box. Maybe you walk in and what you sell is a $15,000 baby. And if there's no baby, no fee. And you're really doing all the medical practice and you're isolating technology and you're improving the data and you're improving all those protocols in order to enhance the performance and the outcome. But you make sure that you're getting paid a fee regardless, and someone else is on the hook because what you're selling is not a service, is not a unit, it's not a cycle. You're selling a child and for $15,000. And if you don't deliver that child, someone is not getting paid. And I'm happy to be that someone.
We're going to put some buttons and links for people to be able to contact you, to be able to get in touch with the company. I suspect that there's other people that are going to say, I want to talk to this guy. When you and I met last year at ASRM, we sat next to each other at dinner, and I thought, this is somebody that people are going to want to talk to. So some people are going to want to have maybe to sit down with you. And this episode's going to come out before ASRM 2024. People are listening to it before ASRM 2024. Would you be all right with me sharing your information if they want to connect with you and making that introduction so that they could meet up with you there?
Absolutely. I met you and I met a lot of people along the way. Those are the most enlightening conversations that shaped a lot of my thinking, but also been invaluable to like how we build Gaia, because I don't want to build a vacuum. And we're building to an existing problem. There is a lot of people that are far more experienced than I am and who we are. We bring a little bit of a new eye to this and a new level of innovation that has not been happened before, but we also are very aware that we don't operate in a vacuum, and I would love that.
The first time that I got connected with Eduardo Harriton and with David Sable, after the first conversation, I thought, man, I'm glad I met that guy. I had that feeling about you, and maybe others will too. Nader AlSalim, thank you so much for coming on the Inside Reproductive Health podcast. I hope to have you on plenty more times.
Thank you, Griffin. I enjoyed this.
Today's episode is paid content from our feature sponsor, who helps Inside Reproductive Health to deliver information for free to you. Here, the advertiser has editorial control. Feature sponsorship is not an endorsement and does not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health.